What if I told you there was once a king so disturbingly disfigured that his own people whispered he was cursed by the devil? Meet Charles II of Spain. A monarch whose very appearance unsettled his royal court, whose deformities made even the most hardened nobles glance away, and whose entire existence became a dark symbol of one family's obsession with power. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched One, but the real horror behind Charles's condition wasn't sorcery or black magic. It was something far more sinister and far more human. Charles II was cursed, and not by demons, but by his own bloodline. This is the twisted story of how Europe's most powerful dynasty, the Habsburgs, sabotaged itself from within, creating a king so tragically malformed that his autopsy would leave even the most skeptical onlookers wondering if the devil had in fact touched him. Imagine you're an ambassador, stepping into the Spanish royal palace for the first time. You're expecting majesty, a towering, commanding figure. Instead, you're met with a man who can't even close his mouth. That was Charles II. His jaw stuck out so far forward that his lips couldn't meet. His mouth hung open constantly, like a door permanently ajar. This wasn't a freak accident of nature. It was the direct result of centuries of inbreeding. The Habsburgs had made one fatal mistake. Over and over again, they married their own. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. The family tree didn't branch, it looped in on itself like a twisted knot. Charles's own parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents on both sides, also uncle and niece. His DNA looked more like a closed circle than a lineage. The result? A condition called mandibular prognathism, better known as the Habsburg jaw. His teeth didn't align at all, the bottom row jutted far ahead of the top. Even when he tried to close his mouth, there was still enough space between his teeth to slide a coin through. Chewing was next to impossible. Because of his deformity, Charles couldn't eat like a normal person. Every meal had to be turned into a kind of royal baby food: soups, mashed vegetables, pureed meats. And even then, food would leak out of his mouth, soup would dribble from his chin, and servants had to stand nearby constantly wiping away the mess. Imagine royal banquets as supposed to be grand displays of luxury and power reduced to pity-filled spectacles, with nobles pretending not to notice their king drooling into his own lap. Speech. That was another challenge altogether. Charles's deformities rendered his speech almost unintelligible. Every word came out slurred and wet. Foreign diplomats require translators not for Spanish, but for deciphering the mumbling noises of their king. Even his own courtiers struggled to understand him. His mother once wrote, in genuine fear, that she worried her son might choke on his own tongue while sleeping. But despite all this, the Habsburgs kept going, marrying within the family, generation after generation. They saw power, not consequences. And Charles was the living embodiment of those consequences. Charles's infamous jaw was only the beginning. By the time he reached adulthood, Charles II looked like someone who had been shaped by a cruel joke of nature. He was just over 5 feet tall, short even for his era, and his proportions were disturbingly off. His head was so large it seemed to wobble on a neck too weak to hold it. His limbs were pencil-thin and skeletal, while his torso was oddly compressed and hunched. He didn't walk until he was 8 years old. Charles spent almost a decade just learning how to stay upright, and even when he did, it wasn't graceful. He shuffled, staggered, leaned on furniture for balance. He moved more like a fragile elderly man than a royal in his prime. Palace records described his movements as tragic. A young king who looked and moved like someone carrying an invisible weight on his back. And in a way, he was. That weight was centuries of genetic failure. Charles's mind had not fared any better than his body. He couldn't read until the age of 10, and even then, he struggled to understand the simplest concepts. His tutors said trying to teach him was like pouring water into a cracked jar. Nothing stayed. Emotionally, he was barely more developed than a toddler. He would throw violent tantrums over trivial frustrations, screaming, kicking, sobbing uncontrollably, then suddenly fall silent and sit alone for hours, staring at nothing. Some servants described him as completely unresponsive, like a puppet with its strings cut. Even his appearance betrayed his condition. His hair fell out in patches, leaving his scalp raw and diseased looking. Court painters had to get creative. They did their best to make him look dignified, but no brush could fully erase the damage. You can still see it if you look closely. The oversized jaw. The lifeless eyes. The awkward posture. A king who looked like he was made of leftover parts. Most people grow into adulthood and reach a plateau. Charles didn't. He continued to decline visibly and alarmingly every year. His body was falling apart in real time. Doctors were baffled. They had no idea how to treat him because they didn't even understand what they were looking at. They were watching a man whose very cells seemed to be unraveling. One court physician remarked privately, "It is as if his body is rejecting life itself," and maybe it was. Charles too wasn't just broken on the outside. His condition affected everything, especially the one thing a king was expected to do above all else, produce an heir. And this wasn't just a personal issue. It was a political disaster waiting to happen. Because when the most powerful throne in Europe sits beneath a king who can't continue the dynasty, the knives come out. Charles married twice. Not for love, but for duty. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, arrived from France expecting to marry a powerful monarch. Instead, she found herself beside a man who could barely function. Their wedding night was reportedly a disaster. Servants later said the young queen left the royal bedchamber in tears. Charles looked confused, possibly even frightened. It wasn't just awkwardness. It was physical. Charles's body, malformed from birth, had also failed to mature sexually. His reproductive organs were so underdeveloped, physicians described them in private as childlike. Simply put, Charles II had the sexual maturity of a boy, in the body of a failing adult. But no one could say that out loud. So, instead, they blamed Marie-Louise. The court labeled her barren. She was subjected to humiliating fertility tests and forced to undergo painful procedures. She drank horrible herbal concoctions. She prayed endlessly. She suffered not just physically, but emotionally. A once vibrant and intelligent young woman became withdrawn and deeply depressed. Some historians now believe the stress, or the treatments themselves, slowly poisoned her. She died suddenly at just 26 years old. The palace moved quickly. Charles was remarried to Marie Anne of Neuburg. This second marriage was even more desperate. Charles was in his 30s now, and his condition had only worsened. Marie Anne later wrote private letters describing her horror at her husband's physical state and her growing realization there would be no heir. Still, the court tried everything. They summoned the best doctors in Europe. They brought in ancient fertility remedies and even tried magical cures. Charles endured humiliating examinations, where physicians poked and measured him, hoping for some miracle. There was none, because the problem wasn't medical, it was genetic. And while Spain kept pretending everything was fine, the rest of Europe was preparing for the inevitable. With science failing, the Spanish court turned to something darker, the supernatural. Priests were called in. The theory: Charles wasn't just sick, he was possessed. And so began some of the strangest episodes in royal history. Public exorcisms performed on a reigning monarch. Father Froilan Diaz, the court's chief exorcist, declared that Charles was infested with demons put there by witches. But these weren't quiet rituals behind chapel doors. These were full-on spectacles, performed in the throne room. Nobles and foreign diplomats were forced to stand and watch as priests shouted Latin incantations while Charles writhed and screamed. They made him drink holy water mixed with pulverized religious relics, bone fragments, and dust scraped from the tombs of saints. He would immediately become violently ill. The priests took it as proof the demons were reacting. Charles would vomit, convulse, and sometimes pass out. They pressed crucifixes against his chest until he cried out. They splashed him with holy water. They made him recite Latin prayers he barely understood, and Charles, emotionally fragile and easily manipulated, believed it was working. Any slight improvement was seen as divine proof, which meant the exorcisms continued, again and again. In 1698, the court took it even further. Father Diaz ordered a spiritual cleansing of the entire palace. Servants gathered anything that might be tainted, personal items from past queens, foreign gifts, furniture. They carried it all into the courtyard and burned it in giant bonfires, while priests chanted prayers of purification. It was absurd, and it was tragic. Because while the court flailed between doctors and demons, Charles was dying in plain sight. His body was shutting down, slowly, painfully, in ways no one could explain, until he finally stopped breathing. Charles II died in 1700. At just 38 years old, his reign had been full of whispers, rumors, and speculation, but now the truth would be laid bare. Royal physicians conducted an autopsy, and what they discovered was so horrific that the Spanish court tried to suppress the findings. But like all secrets, the details leaked. And they were worse than anyone imagined. Dr. Jerónimo de la Fuente Perola led the examination. His notes read like something out of a horror novel. Let's start with the heart. Charles's heart was no larger than a walnut. Shriveled, blackened, weighing a fraction of what it should. A normal adult heart weighs about 300 grams. His barely reached 50. His lungs were diseased and full of fluid, corroded, as if rotting from the inside out. The stench from his chest cavity was reportedly so foul that assistants had to leave the room. But the real nightmare was in his abdomen. His intestines were putrefied, gangrenous, rotting while he was still alive, and his reproductive organs, exactly what doctors had long suspected, catastrophically underdeveloped, confirming once and for all that Charles was physically incapable of producing an heir. Finally, they opened his skull. What they found stunned even the most experienced physicians. His brain was floating in an excess of fluid, a condition now known as hydrocephalus. The brain tissue itself was discolored, possibly damaged beyond repair. It explained everything: the intellectual delay, the seizures, the erratic behavior. Dr. Perola ended his report with a chilling sentence. It is a miracle this body sustained life for so long, as it contained not a single healthy organ. That single line shattered what remained of the myth. Charles II wasn't cursed by witches. He wasn't possessed by demons. He was destroyed by his own bloodline. With Charles gone and no heir to follow, Europe erupted. The War of Spanish Succession broke out almost immediately. It lasted over a decade and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. All because a royal family had believed that keeping power meant keeping the blood pure. Habsburg's centuries-long obsession with inbreeding had created a king who couldn't rule, couldn't reproduce, and barely survived. A man so broken by genetics that his very body became a warning from history. And in the end, that warning cost an entire continent. If you're fascinated by these disturbing corners of royal history, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me what hidden story I should uncover next.